before the headlines, before the blood. Robert Markel was just a man chasing peace in the wild. At Cicherie, he wasn't trying to break records or go viral. He wasn't a thrill seeker. He was something far rarer, a quiet soul who found home in the silence of the forest. Friends called him Bear Whisperer, not because he tamed animals, but because he respected them. Every weekend, rain or shine, Robert vanished into the trees with nothing but his old Nikon camera, a notebook, and a single goal: to capture beauty most people scroll past. He wasn't famous, he didn't need to be, but to those who knew him, Robert's life was full of meaning until one final hike turned it into a mystery that shook everyone who heard it. It was a crisp autumn morning when Robert set out on what would become his final hike. He had chosen a remote trail deep in Wells Gray Provincial Park, a place known for its rugged beauty, towering pines, and eerie silence. Robert posted one last photo on social media, a mist-covered path vanishing into the trees, captioned simply, "Boom! Off the grid, off the grid, back in 3 days." He packed light, just enough food, a water flask, his camera gear, and a weathered field journal he always carried. But what Robert didn't know was that something else was watching him, something patient, something powerful, and something that would not let him come back. If you're watching this, hit the like button and subscribe, because stories like this aren't just about fear. They're about survival, awareness, and the unpredictable wild. Now listen closely, because what you're about to hear is not fiction. It started with silence. Robert Markel had been walking for nearly an hour, his boots crunching over fallen leaves, camera slung over one shoulder, and that familiar calm in his chest. To him, this was peace. No phone calls, no traffic, just the quiet rhythm of the forest breathing around him. But then something shifted. At first, it was subtle, a twig snapping behind him, but not in the careless way a deer might step. It was deliberate, measured, like something trying not to be heard. He paused, glanced over his shoulder, and saw nothing but trees. Just a breeze swaying through the canopy. He took another few steps, slower now, another snap, closer this time. Oh, he stopped walking and reached for the small voice recorder he often used to document his thoughts while hiking. Click. The red light flicked on. Thursday sure surveillance. Strange sounds behind me. Possibly a bear. I've had encounters before, nothing aggressive. I'll keep my distance if I see it. His tone was steady. Not afraid, just cautious, but the sounds didn't stop. The moment he started walking again, so did the follower. The pacing matched his steps. It stopped when he stopped, it moved when he moved, but still, he couldn't see it. The forest seemed to swallow everything in shadow, and the deeper he went, the heavier the air became. Experts say that when a bear stalks a human, which is rare but not unheard of, it doesn't charge immediately. It studies, watches, waits, especially if it's an older bear or one that's become dangerously used to humans. And this one was already too close. Robert made the decision to veer off trail slightly, heading toward higher ground to get a better view. It was a photographer's instinct, but also a survival one. From a hill, you can scan the forest, get your bearings, maybe scare it off, but the hill only gave him something worse: silence again. For a brief moment, the forest felt completely still. No birds, no rustling, nothing. And then, in the distance, maybe 30 yards away, he saw it, a black bear, large, scarred along the muzzle, standing perfectly still behind a fallen log, barely visible in the underbrush. He whispered into his recorder, "Rand, I see it. Black bear, staring right at me, not moving. I'm going to back away slowly." That's what you're taught to do. Don't run, don't scream, don't turn your back. Robert followed the rules. He backed away step by step, never breaking eye contact. But the bear didn't retreat. It advanced, one slow step, then another, and another. No huffing, no bluff, just pure, focused intent. He whispered again, "Pretty still coming, not charging yet, but it's following. It's just not normal behavior." At this point, the calm in his voice began to crack. Robert was about a quarter mile from where his car was parked. Too far to sprint, too close to believe he couldn't make it. He turned slightly, walking backward down the slope, careful not to trip over rocks or roots. And that's when the bear made its move. It broke into a fast trot. Robert stopped recording. Maybe he pocketed the device. Maybe he dropped it. What we know for sure is that the next closer seconds were a living nightmare. The bear charged. No warning sounds, no standing on hind legs, no posturing. Just a direct, deadly sprint. Robert ran. He broke the rules, but what else could he do? The terrain worked against him. Uneven ground, loose soil, jagged roots. Witnesses who later listened to the audio logs said they heard the rustling get faster, louder, frantic, followed by a thud and a sharp, guttural scream. He was tackled, then dragged. The initial attack site showed signs of struggle. Branches snapped, claw marks on trees, a shattered camera lens. But the bear didn't maul him there. It grabbed him by the shoulder, some say, based on the blood patterns and torn fabric, and pulled him deeper into the woods. This wasn't a defensive swipe. This wasn't about food left behind. This was predatory behavior. Robert's flashlight, one of those slim tactical ones, was later found still on, its beam pointing toward a trail of broken fern and blood, smears vanishing into the dark. And in the chaos there were no witnesses. No one heard his cries in real time. The nearest camper was over a mile away. It wasn't until 3 days later that rangers, using scent tracking dogs and heat sensing drones, located the site where Robert had been taken. What they found would lead to national headlines, but in those minutes between his last whisper and his final breath, he was utterly alone, deep in the wilderness he had once called sanctuary. Some say the worst part isn't the attack, it's the wait. That paralyzing knowledge that something is watching you, moving with you, deciding whether or not to kill you. And Robert felt all of that, every moment, every heartbeat. This wasn't a random tragedy. It was a slow, calculated stalking by an animal that had, for reasons we may never fully understand, turned from shy forest dweller to silent predator. And it shows Robert what drove the bear to that point. Hunger, territory, a brain parasite? Or was it simply a clash between one man's love for solitude and nature's unfiltered violence? In the next part of the story, we follow the desperate search, the discovery of Robert's remains, and what authorities found that still raises questions to this day. But for now, remember this, and when you step into the wild, the rules are no longer yours. And sometimes nature doesn't let you leave. The search team found Robert's broken flashlight first. Nature doesn't let you fur. It lay half buried under wet leaves, its beam still faintly flickering, pointing into the dense underbrush like a forgotten signal. Just a few feet ahead, claw marks gouged the bark of a young pine, ripped clean through the outer layer. The ground was torn, roots exposed, and scattered with blood. This was the site of the struggle. And it wasn't over quickly. Investigators believe Robert was still alive when the bear dragged him nearly 50 feet from the trail. His gear, a shredded backpack, his camera case, and a crushed canteen was scattered in a crooked line through the trees, like a trail of breadcrumbs no one arrived in time to follow. But the bear wasn't in a rush. No, it moved with brutal precision. This wasn't a frenzied, confused attack. It was silent, focused, a sustained act of control, and that's what makes Robert's death so terrifying. He didn't die instantly. They could tell by the defensive wounds. Deep gashes across his forearms, as if he'd tried to shield his face. Even his teeth tore into his shoulder. Scratches on tree trunks suggest he grabbed at anything he could to resist being pulled. But a C-by-pound black bear is nearly unstoppable once it commits. Robert never stood a chance. Forensic specialists said his trail ended at the base of a large cedar, where the soil had been disturbed as if something had tried to bury him. That's when they knew the bear wasn't just protecting food, it was stashing a kill. A behavior more common in grizzlies and mountain lions, but increasingly observed in black bears that lose fear of humans. Robert had become prey, not because he provoked it, not because he ran, but because something, somewhere, went very, very wrong. The discovery shook the search team. Um, One ranger who had spent several years tracking bear movement in the region said he had never seen a case like this. Black bears usually free as bluffs. They do some and the estatus tube, the hisitat. Black bears usually bluff. They charge and stop. They huff. They back off. But this one didn't hesitate. It stalked. It dragged, and it covered him. That's not defense. That's a decision. Oh, no. But the horror didn't end with Robert's final breath. What followed was an agonizing debate among wildlife officials, conservationists, and the public. Was this bear sick? Was it starving? Had it been habituated by tourists feeding it snacks? Or had it simply developed a taste for human blood? In the days after the attack, park rangers placed motion sensor cameras in the area. What they captured chilled them. The same bear, large, scarred, and unmistakable, returned to the site several times. Sniffing, digging, circling. It had marked the area. This was now its kill zone. Authorities made the controversial decision to hunt and euthanize the animal. It took 2 days to track it down. When they did, it didn't run. It stood its ground, just like it had with Robert. The autopsy confirmed the worst. Human DNA was found in its digestive tract. Robert's family was notified that same evening he had vanished on a quiet hike. Now, his story was on every major news outlet in Canada, his name echoing through articles, bet, interviews, and social media tributes. A man who once cherished the forest had been taken by it in the most violent way imaginable, and yet something even darker lingered. You see, it wasn't just the attack that disturbed people. It was the way it unfolded. The bear stalked him for over Urser's minutes before striking. That's not normal. That's not instinctual panic. That's calculated. The audio logs recovered from Robert's recorder, partially damaged but partially intact, captured faint panting, quick footsteps, and twice. Low growling, not near, not far, just behind. One expert who reviewed the audio said the growls weren't loud. They were almost quiet on purpose. It wanted him to know it was there, he said. Not to scare him off, but to feed the fear. There was something haunting in that idea, the predator that doesn't rush, doesn't roar, but waits, tests, yes, measures. Robert was not just caught off guard. He was studied. The media latched onto this narrative. Headlines called it Canada's first human stalking bear. Some dismissed that as exaggeration. Others, including longtime wildlife specialists, weren't so sure. One thing was certain. This wasn't just an accident in the wild. This was something else. A quiet, chilling reminder that for all our knowledge, all our gear, all our respect for nature, sometimes we don't know what walks those woods. Sometimes we walk right into the mouth of the forest and it decides to keep us. Robert's death wasn't quick, it wasn't clean, but it was real and it was avoidable. In the next section, we'll explore what happened after the desperate search, the frantic effort to make sense of the attack, and the emotional impact on those who knew and loved him. No, but before that, ask yourself, would you have seen the signs? Would you have trusted your instincts? Hmm? Would you have turned back when the silence became too deep, or, like Robert, would you have kept walking forward, thinking the forest was still your friend? The forest doesn't speak in words. When a man disappears in the wild, it doesn't leave clear signs. No flashing arrows. No cries. No cries for help. Just broken branches, disturbed leaves, and silence. When Robert Markel failed to return home that weekend, his sister Angela was the first to worry. He was always punctual. If he said 3 days, he meant 3 days. No excuses, no delays. His phone was off, as expected, but when Monday evening came and he hadn't responded, she called the park office. At first they weren't alarmed. Hikers ran late all the time. But by Tuesday morning, When his car was still parked at the trailhead and no one had seen him in over 24 hours, the tone changed. Search and rescue was activated by noon. They started where most stories end, the last known location. Robert's car, locked and clean, was found parked neatly beside the entrance to the Cypress Basin Trail. Inside were his phone charger, a half-empty thermos, and a map of the area folded open to a section called Raven's Hollow. It was a known trail, but not a popular one. Steep, quiet, and tangled with undergrowth. Perfect for photography. But terrible for rescue. The team fanned out in a grid. Rangers, local volunteers, 2K Joe units. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning the canopy. But visibility was a nightmare. Fog clung to the trees like smoke. The terrain was slick, and the sun vanished early beneath the thick branches. By nightfall, they had found nothing. Not a shred of clothing, not a footprint, not a sound. Angela refused at Stiffrey. Angela refused to leave. She sat in her car overnight, waiting, watching, hoping to see his silhouette walking out of the forest, apologizing, laughing, camera around his neck. But morning came, and Robert didn't. On the second day, they brought in scent tracking dogs. That's when things changed. The dogs picked up something, a faint trace leading off the main trail into a patch of deep bush. Rangers followed. About 7 meters in, they found the first clue, a water bottle, bent and cracked, with a bloody thumbprint on the lid. From there, the signs came faster. A torn camera strap, a crushed lens cap, and then silence again. One of the rangers said it felt wrong. Not like someone got lost, like something had tried to erase him, cover the tracks, smother the evidence. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Near the base of a hill, just beyond a downed log, one of the searchers spotted a smear of red against the bark of a tree. Blood, faint but unmistakable. There were also claw marks, deep, furious slashes in the trunk. Too wide for a cougar. Too high for a wolf. It was a bear. Suddenly, everything escalated. Now, this wasn't a missing persons case. It was a potential wildlife fatality. And that changed how they searched. They moved slower, more cautiously, with firearms. They started scanning not just for signs of Robert, but for signs of a predator still in the area. On the third day, they found what they were most afraid of. Near the ravine's edge, about 6 minutes from the blood-stained tree, they came across disturbed soil, piled branches, flattened leaves, and the unmistakable smell of death. Buried shallow beneath the dirt, partially covered by foliage, they found human remains. It was Robert. His body was intact but torn, defensive wounds, deep lacerations, blunt trauma. The coroner would later confirm he died from a combination of blood loss and crushed ribs, likely from the bear's jaws pressing down. But there was no sign of his face. It had been mauled. Near his body lay a small audio recorder, still partially functional, water damaged but not destroyed. What it captured would never be released publicly. But those who heard it described it as gut-wrenching. You could hear him whispering, breathing fast. Footsteps. Then silence. Then a low growl and a scream that cut off too quickly. A ranger who reviewed the recording said it haunted him. He knew he was being hunted. That's what shakes you. He wasn't surprised. He was terrified because he saw it coming. The discovery devastated Angela. All she had now was a zipped body bag and a list of unanswered questions. Why hadn't Robert turned back sooner? Why hadn't anyone warned him about recent bear activity? Why did the bear stalk instead of retreat? The park issued a statement that week confirming the death and urging hikers to avoid solo treks. They closed the Ravens Hollow Trail indefinitely and posted warnings across the region. But for Angela, that wasn't enough. She started digging, asking questions, contacting wildlife experts. What she learned horrified her even more. This wasn't the first aggressive encounter reported in that area. Over the past 6 months, There had been 3 close calls involving black bears in Wells Gray, including a case where a bear approached a campsite and refused to leave, even when shouted. No one had been hurt, so the reports weren't made public. Angela believes those early warning signs were ignored, and Robert paid the price. K. The black bear responsible for the attack was eventually tracked and euthanized after it returned to the site, circling the area, sniffing, digging. Rangers confirmed its identity through fur samples and bite measurements. Reno. Autopsy revealed what they feared most: human remains in its stomach. The news shook the province. Hikers canceled trips. Parks reevaluated trail safety policies. Experts appeared on TV warning of the risks of wildlife habituation. But for those who loved Robert, the media storm brought no peace. His friends described him as gentle, respectful, always prepared. He didn't take risks, he wasn't careless, he trusted nature, maybe too much. One friend said he saw the forest as a sanctuary. Stay first to say the mord he've de Cecilier Raisty face Stuzuters beefthess. I don't think he ever imagined it could turn on him like this. But that's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Nature doesn't turn on us. It simply is. And sometimes it reminds us with teeth and claws that it doesn't owe us safety. Robert's story isn't just tragic, it's a warning. It's where Mil so Carter Saroa, one that echoes through the trees long after the screams have faded. In the next and final chapter, we'll look at what's left behind, the legacy of Robert Markel. And what we must all learn before stepping into the wild again, because in the woods, silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means you're already being watched. Subscribe for more true wilderness horror stories. Stay aware, stay safe, and stay alive. The forest gave him back. But not all at once. Robert Markel's remains were recovered in silence. No crowd, no cameras, just a small team of exhausted rangers kneeling in the damp soil, brushing away pine needles like archaeologists uncovering a tragedy. He had been missing for nearly 4 days. But what they found told a story that stretched far beyond the hours he was gone. His body lay partially buried beneath a cedar tree, covered with branches, mud, and moss. It was a primitive grave, not made by human hands, but by something ancient, something instinctive. Yeah. The bear had returned several times. Rangers confirmed it by the fresh claw marks in the bark and the matted ground nearby. They believed it was guarding him, not feeding, guarding, as if claiming ownership of what it had taken. That detail changed everything. This wasn't just an attack, this was possession. Animals kill for food, for defense, for fear. But when one kills and returns, buries and lingers, that's not instinct. That's something else, something darker. It took hours to carefully remove what remained. His limbs were twisted, his ribs crushed inward, his face almost unrecognizable. But his watch still worked, and the time frozen on its cracked surface suggested that from the moment of his last voice recording to the moment his heart stopped beating, only 16 minutes had passed. 16 minutes of running, fighting, bleeding, praying the trees would hide him. 16 minutes that felt like an eternity, recorded only by the forest and by the bear that watched him die. They carried him out in a black body bag before sunset. Not on a stretcher, the terrain wouldn't allow it, but across shoulders, mile after mile, through the same trees that had swallowed him whole just days before. Angela was waiting near the ranger station. She didn't cry at first, just stood still staring like she was trying to listen for his voice in the wind. The forensic report was clinical: broken bones, lacerations, bite marks consistent with Ursus americanus. But Angela didn't care about the science. She already knew what had happened. What haunted her wasn't how he died, it was what he must have felt before it happened. She asked the rangers one question. Ferdial. Was he scared? No one had an answer. The investigation continued quietly. The bear was tracked using heat signatures and hair samples found at the site. When they located it near a freshwater stream 2 days later, it didn't run, it didn't growl. It just stood there, watching, like it had seen this all before a single shot ended its life. And inside its stomach they found the final confirmation: fragments of Robert's jacket, part of his field notebook, and worse. After the autopsy, one ranger, a man with years of experience, said Wierniel, "I've never seen a bear act like that." It wasn't confused, it wasn't scared, it knew exactly what it was doing. Robert's death marked one of the rarest forms of fatal bear attacks in North America. Not accidental, not defensive, but deliberate. Experts would later debate why. Some blamed climate stress. Others believed it had lost fear of humans after too many close encounters, and a few whispered of something stranger, something spiritual. There's a legend among the Secwepemc people indigenous to the region about a shadow that sometimes lives inside wild things. A hunger that isn't just for flesh but for fear. They call it the Nakwaxta XW. The one who walks with silence. Angela heard the story weeks later from a local elder. She didn't reject it. In fact, she found comfort in it because if the thing that killed Robert wasn't just an animal, maybe it wasn't her brother's fault. Maybe it wasn't anyone's. What Robert was cremated and scattered across the same forest that took him, per his wishes. But before that, Angela did one final thing. She developed the last roll of film found in his camera. Most of the shots were damaged, blurred, waterlogged, but two frames were intact. One showed the forest at dawn, golden light filtering through the fog, trees stretching like cathedral columns, pure serenity. The other was darker, framed off-center, as if the photo had been taken in a rush. In the bottom corner of the image, mostly obscured by shadow, was what appeared to be the outline of a bear, watching from behind the trees, low to the ground. Still, Angela never showed that picture to anyone. She keeps it in a drawer, wrapped in plastic. Proof that her brother saw it maybe seconds before it charged. Maybe the last thing he ever captured. She later said Brown that bear took his body. But the forest still holds his spirit, and maybe he's still walking out there, camera in hand, catching the light before anyone else sees it. The park reopened Raven's Hollow Trail the following year with new warning signs, bear-safe bins, and strict solo hiking rules. But those who remember Robert, they don't go back, not because of the trail, not because of the bear, but because now they know what it feels like to lose someone to the silence, and the silence never forgets. In the final section of this story, we'll remember Robert the man, not the victim, and share what this tragedy has taught us about nature, caution, and the thin line between peace and peril in the wild. He died alone, but he did not die forgotten. In the weeks following Robert Markel's death, something strange happened. His story, once buried in a back-page news column about a hiker killed by wildlife, exploded across the internet. Reddit threads, YouTube breakdowns, true crime podcasts, wilderness survival forums. Everyone wanted to know, who was this man who walked into the woods and never came back? Angela, overwhelmed by the attention, stayed quiet for days. Then one night she posted a single photograph on her brother's old Instagram account. It was Robert, standing on a rocky overlook, arms outstretched to the sunrise, camera bag over his shoulder. The caption read, "Yo, he died doing what he loved, but that doesn't make it any less cruel, please." Duh. Learned from this, the post went viral. Suddenly, Robert wasn't just a name. He was a symbol of beauty, of tragedy, of the delicate tension between man and nature. Hundreds of comments flooded in. He reminds me of my brother, always disappearing into the wild. I used to hike alone. Never again. This broke me. Thank you for telling his story. Angela didn't expect it. But the response gave her purpose. She began to speak out, not in anger, but in warning. She did interviews, shared Robert's journals, advocated for stricter wildlife education for hikers. She started a small foundation, the Markel Project, designed to raise awareness about solo hiking risks, bear safety, and mental wellness through nature. She said Robert believed the wild could heal us. He still believed that even in his last moments. I want to honor that, but I also want people to know how fast it can turn on you. Survival experts were brought in to analyze Robert's decisions. Some praised his caution, using a recorder, tracking his surroundings, moving slowly. Others pointed out the signs he missed, Rimdal hiking alone in known bear territory, veering off marked trails, no bear spray, no emergency beacon, small things. Easy to forget until they become the only things that matter. One expert said, "Berendral survival isn't just gear. It's preparation. It's planning your escape before you need one." Robert was smart, but the wild is smarter. And the bear, it became a quiet ghost in the conversation. People didn't want to talk about the animal. They wanted a villain. But nature doesn't offer easy answers. The bear was doing what bears sometimes do. And Robert was simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment with the wrong predator. But that's what makes his story matter, because it could have been anyone, a wildlife photographer, a backpacking couple, a teenager out for a challenge. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a reminder that the silence of the forest is not always gentle, that the line between peace and peril is invisible, and that sometimes we don't know we've crossed it until it's too late. Angela's last public statement was short. He didn't die because he was weak. He died because he was human. Now, a final question for you. Would you have noticed the signs? Would you have backed away at the first snap of a branch? Or would you, like Robert, have trusted that the forest still loved you? We tell stories like this not to scare, but to remind, to make you think twice before stepping off the path, to help you listen to your instincts, to understand that the wild does not hate us, but it doesn't protect us either. It is beautiful. It is brutal. It is honest. Robert Markel wanted to capture that honesty in his photos, in his notebooks, in the way he walked quietly through the trees as if the forest were a cathedral. He never raised his voice. He never forced a moment. He waited. He observed. He respected the silence. And in the end, it consumed him. But his story doesn't end with blood on the leaves. It ends with us, the people left behind, the ones who now carry his lesson forward, the ones who remember that a camera cannot stop a bear, and bravery is not the same as safety. The trail where he vanished has been renamed by locals. Unofficially, they call it Markel's Hollow, a place of beauty, a place of memory, a place where the wind still moves softly through the trees, carrying a warning for anyone who dares to walk alone. Be still, be wise, and never forget who walks beside you in silence. Subscribe now to Stories with Macukes for more real stories of the wild, the beautiful, the tragic, and the true. Because sometimes the most terrifying predators make no sound at all.